The transmitter is warm under my palms, and the world outside the glass sounds like something dying slowly, a long, grinding cough of wind over ash. If you're tuned in, you already know the shape of it. The sky is a bruise, not blue, but a thick, low ceiling of gray that never lifts. Daylight comes in as a weak, wrong color, like someone left a lantern on inside a closed room. The sun is a coin behind soot. Sometimes it burns orange at the edge. Sometimes it disappears altogether for days. Weather is no longer weather. It's an accusation. Where I sit, old maps on the wall mean nothing. Roads that knifed through valleys and climbed into mountains are buried in a fine gray that looks like snow but chokes like flour. Trees that used to stand sentinel along the highway are blackened husks. The lakes, Mammoth and Mono and those others the tourists wrote postcards about, are either clogged with ash or their waters boiled away and cracked into salt flats. Buildings I could name with my eyes closed have become ghost stations of rust and skeletal concrete. Shopping centers turned into caverns of dust, office towers gutted and leaning, bridges sagged into rivers of silt. The landmarks we used to navigate by are honest now, ruined and useless. Memory doesn't map to the land anymore. The eruption wasn't a single headline. It was a slow, terrible coronation. The first blast took lives with fire and flame. The long cloud that followed hung like a lid and began stealing seasons. Ash is the new border. It travels in thick curtains, it coats lungs, it eats machinery, it clogs the veins of cities. Crops died not just because the sky dimmed, because the ash made the soil sour, because acid rains came in strange, sweet smells that burned skin and leaf. Where once there were orchards and farms, there are now fields of crusted gray and the skeletons of irrigation pumps frozen in place. Water went from abundant to contested faster than we learned to say the word ration. Rivers that fed towns are either diverted into clogged channels or turned into sludge by runoff. Wells that used to be the stubborn heart of a neighborhood are poisoned by fallout. The taste of water now carries a memory of metal and rot. Power is a rumor. The high-voltage lines that braided the valleys are down, snapped poles, melted transformers, circuit boards blanketed in grit. When the grid failed, we discovered the fragility of our conveniences. When the truck stopped, the convenience became a myth. Institutions that promised shelter, governments, corporations, emergency services, stretched and tore. At first, the state tried. Advisories, evacuation corridors, convoys. The convoys became targets, then calendars, then nothing. Emergency shelters filled faster than they could resupply, and then emptied into lawlessness when fuel ran out. Local governments lasted longer where community ties were tight. In wide, anonymous cities, the vacuum got filled by whoever had guns, water, or a louder voice. Some hospitals clung on battered, bacteria-ridden refuges with generators that stuttered, run by people who hadn't slept in weeks. Universities turned into libraries and laboratories haunted by technicians scavenging solar cells and power inverters. The post office, the DMV, the rest ghosts. Humanity sorted itself into small, brutal ecosystems. There are survivor enclaves, people who knit themselves together with strict rules, trade networks, and barbed wire. They trade stories and batteries and sometimes children's laughter. There are roaming bands too, scavengers with maps of broken malls and a vocabulary of plunder, and raiders who took the old allegiances of empire and replaced them with contempt. Between those poles are the loners, people like me who keep a voice alive on a battery and a pedal generator, trying to stitch a thread of order into the static. Communication is now a holy thing. Radios are shrines. A functioning transmitter can be a bargaining chip, a beacon, or a bomb. It can bring people together or send them running. We are a scattered congregation, listening to each other's admissions, lies, and occasional truths. Libraries of data died with servers and cooling systems. What remains are the analog things. Paper, diesel engines somebody knows how to fix, the stubborn old transistor that refuses to give up. Even myths travel now, rumors of fertile valleys, of a canyon where the ash somehow thinned, of a reactor quietly providing power to a town that keeps its doors locked. Most of it is wishful thinking. Some of it is danger. The environment itself is unkind in new ways. The ash brings cold nights. We learned the terrible lesson of volcanic winter, a sky so choked the sun can't warm the ground. Crops fail in that shadow. But there are flashes of heat too, fires that start where the ash is thin and still hot embers lurk, or where the wind pushes embers into a sleeping ruin. So the world alternates between a cold I did not know my bones could take and sudden, frantic heat. That rhythm has changed us. It makes people hasty, suspicious, quick to trade tomorrow for today. There is an anxiety that sits under everything, a low humming expectation that something else will break. We wait like people under a cracked dam. We watch the ash-laden clouds on the horizon and count the days since the last shipment, the last clean rain, the last time a child's laugh didn't cough. The future is a ledger of shortages and memories. Still, we move, scavenging, bartering, keeping watch. We keep small lights lit, candles, flashlights, the glimmer of a makeshift radio studio, because the alternative is silence, and silence is where despair grows teeth. So I speak into this microphone. I describe what I see because description keeps us honest, and because even in this ruined geometry, naming things makes them less monstrous. There are ruins, yes, but there are also people, arrangements of stubbornness and tenderness trying to keep a world from unmaking itself. The ash will keep falling for a while. We will learn to live under its shadow, or we will not. Either way, I will say what I see until the transmitter dies. I was not always a voice on the air. Once, I had a desk with a window that looked over a parking lot, a name badge that smelled faintly of coffee, and a life that fit neatly into a calendar. My name on paperwork is something practical and forgettable. On the air, people started calling me Harrington, because it sounded like someone who could be trusted. Names matter less now than they did, but when someone calls you by the same syllables night after night, they become a small anchor. So Harrington I stayed. When the mountains gave up their breath and the sky filled with ash, I learned the radio by necessity. I had a background that helped, years tinkering with old electronics, a knack for finding the fault in a circuit, but skill alone doesn't keep a transmitter alive. It takes stubbornness, and a slow acceptance that this is what you will do until your hands fail you or the batteries do. I run the station from what used to be a ranger's cabin on the edge of town, a squat of concrete, half buried by drifts of gray. Its windows are boarded with planks scrounged from porch steps and store facades. The antenna is a jury-rigged tower of rebar and cable, a crooked thing that leans toward whatever sky we have left. My day begins with routine, because ritual is the only prayer I can manage. I pedal the hand-crank generator for an hour, just enough to top the battery and warm my hands. The generator makes a sound like a patient animal, poor, throaty, and loyal as far as machines go. I polish contacts with an old toothbrush and check the solder joints on the transmitter. If you have ever had to calm a relay in the dead of night, you will understand the intimacy of maintenance. A tightening of a nut, a careful reflow of solder, a whispered apology to a component that has kept you alive. I make coffee with water that tastes faintly of rust and charcoal and call it good. I write the day's log in a notebook, the paper edges soft and smudged, the ink sometimes blotting when the ash finds its way into the cabin. Survival is small and specific. We collect rain when it decides to fall, scattered, greasy drops that skirt the edges of ash clouds. We use cloth and charcoal filters and a cottage industry of patience to make it drinkable. My neighbors, there are always a few. A retired mechanic who can coax a diesel engine out of a grave. A woman who keeps bees in a metal drum and sells honey that tastes of smoke. Trade me fuel and food for information. Information is currency. I swap weather observations and warnings for a tin of peaches or a handful of battery cells. We barter with the old habits of civilization because currency is reduced to what fits in a pocket and will not go rancid. I am a scavenger of sorts. I walk the skeletons of the nearby towns with a list I have memorized like scripture. Batteries, copper, wires, anything with a filament or a fuse. I move slow and soft because the ash makes sound when you hurry. I have learned the geography of danger, the places raiders like to pick over, the houses where families left in a rush and took only what they could. I avoid the intersections where the raiders hang out now. They have made themselves elegant in their brutality, a flash of welded metal and shouted commandments. We have rules here. Don't go alone into the market ruins at dusk. Don't betray the coordinates of someone's water source. And never underestimate the hunger in a man who has seen a child cough and not be able to stop it. Loss is the shape of my hands. I have pockets full of photographs that mean nothing to the world and everything to me. There was a woman once, Claire, who laughed like rain used to. We had a life threaded with ordinary things. Movies, grocery runs, a dog who liked to roll in dead leaves. The dog is gone. Claire is gone. The last time I saw her, the ash was already thick enough to make the street look like a stage set, like some cheap production that had forgotten its actors. We tried to leave together. The convoy didn't make it. I will not say what happened. Memory has a mercy and sometimes keeps the worst out of reach. But I can still taste the copper tang of blood if I think about that morning too long. Guilt sits on me in the small hours like a cold cat, and I talk to it sometimes when the mic is off. My listeners do not have to know everything. They do not deserve to carry more than they can. What keeps me going is not vengeance, and not duty in any official sense. It is the sound of other people's voices in my head when the cabin is silent. It is the life that signals on the low-frequency bands at odd hours. A woman in a canyon with a ham radio. Teenagers in a basement broadcasting music scraped from an old MP3 drive. A priest in a town who manages to grow tomatoes in a subterranean greenhouse. When someone responds to my signal, it is a proof that we are still a species that connects. Hope is not a roaring thing for me. It is a small, fierce ember that I warm with my breath. I keep the transmitter on because someone somewhere might hear a schedule, or a warning, or a name they thought they had lost. I keep it on because one voice can make a human out of another in the lonely hours. The radio has given me a role that is both silly and profound. People call in with messages. If anyone finds my brother, tell him he's got a sweater in the third drawer. And I read them because they keep memory alive. I take on the confessions too, secrets in the night, admissions of things people did so they could eat. I do not judge. I put them on the air like a ledger and let the sound do the weighing. Sometimes I get calls from children who ask questions about before. They want to know what snow tasted like, what pizza felt like when it burned the roof of your mouth, what a blue sky looked like. I do my best to give them answers that are true enough to be useful and generous enough to be gentle. There are moments when the station is a beacon and moments when it is a target. A transmitter with a range is an invitation. In the early months, we had groups try to take over our broadcast because they believed control of the air meant control of people. I had to learn to be diplomatic over the mic, softening warnings into suggestions, allowing different factions to say their piece while not letting bloodlust occupy the channel. On occasion, a choir of radios will harmonize across valleys, people in different enclaves agreeing on a schedule, trading intel, creating a fragile network. Those harmonies are worth more than fuel in my mouth. They remind me that we can coordinate kindness as well as cruelty. What I do to survive is practical, and in that practicality is a kind of poetry. I keep spare parts wrapped in oilcloth, and I catalog them with a penknife I sharpen every week. I mend clothes at a time when the seams of cities have already unraveled. I teach whoever will listen how to read a barometer or check the integrity of a jerry can. On my best days, I am a teacher. On my worst, I am merely a voice that repeats the obvious until someone acts on it. Nighttime is the worst. The ash cools and the world becomes a collection of silhouettes. Each house a promise and a threat. I lock the doors, but locks are only symbols now. Men with bolt cutters can silence them. I keep a small pistol not because I want to be violent, but because deterrence still works in this economy of fear. Most nights, the pistol stays on the shelf, covered by a towel so it doesn't gleam too attractively in moonlight. I sleep in small fits and dream of Claire's face, ordinary and unburned. I wake and pedal the generator and make coffee and read the log and talk into the mic because ritual keeps me from rolling into nothing. Every so often I get letters, funny, tender, and sometimes cruel, tucked into me by travelers. Harrington, they say, we found a patch of green. Or Harrington, we followed your last coordinates and they were empty. The letters remind me that the world is not a monolith of suffering. It is a scatter of human stories, some bright, some obscured. I deliver them on air when I can because people need to hear that they are not alone in the dark. People ask sometimes why I don't leave, why I don't try to find a more stable enclave or the rumored safe valley up north. The answer is not heroic. I am tethered to the microphone because it is the only place where my small acts have ripple effects. If I leave, someone else may find the station and take it for themselves. That has happened before. If I leave, a node of information goes dark. And selfishly, there is an inertia to grief. Moving means telling my chest to release something it has not yet finished holding. There is also responsibility. The station is a map. My logs, my weather reports, my list of found supplies have become a crude atlas other people consult. I file coordinates of clean wells, note days when the ash cleared enough for birds to return, and record names of people who can help with diesel or medicine. In a world where institutions fractured, private things became public goods when they mattered. My little archive matters. I protect it the way one protects an heirloom, because it contains the means for others to survive. Sometimes I imagine a future where someone hears a recording of my voice and recognizes it as proof that someone once tried to keep people talking. That is a strange vanity, perhaps, but I like to imagine the microphone living me as a relic, an artifact that says there were people who did not abandon communication even when the hill of ash weighed down on them. For now, the work is daily. I solder, I barter, I scavenge. I read names into a static-laced sky. I remember Claire and the dog and the mundane life that felt endless until it broke. I keep the transmitter warm under my palms and the logbook stacked with entries. And when the night comes, I fill it with voices because hope is not a single blaze but a chorus. If hope is fragile, then so are we. But even fragile things are resilient if tended. I will tend this voice as long as I have breath and as long as someone somewhere is listening. The ash came like a verdict. It did not roar and finish. It settled in, layer by layer, changing the rules of the world so quietly you could almost miss the moment the rules had been changed. At first it was a nuisance, the gutters clogged, a fine gray film on every surface. But then it became the reason the tractors would not start, the reason the lungs wheezed, the reason a child's cough turned into a calendar of hospital visits that never happened. What followed wasn't simple famine or a single flood. It was a cascade of failures, each one feeding the next until survival stopped being a long-term plan and became a sequence of urgent decisions. The primary crisis is twofold and linked: the eruption and the climate response it set in motion. When Long Valley gave up its breath, it threw ash and gas high into the atmosphere. That ash is not just grit. The volcano also pumped massive amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, which turned into sulfate aerosols that scatter sunlight. Those aerosols act like a thin veil over the planet, reflecting incoming solar radiation and lowering surface temperatures, what scientists call a volcanic winter. It's not dramatic in the way we imagined, no instant ice, but it is long, it is cold, and it reshapes the growing season for hundreds of miles. Our summers drooped. The sun was a dim coin. Fields that once rippled with wheat went quiet beneath a slow dusk. The science of this is clear. Eruptions inject sulfur gases and particulates that can remain in the stratosphere for years, cooling the surface and altering weather patterns. Ash itself is a killer in small, abrasive ways. It clogs filters, abrades leaves, blocks stomata on plants, and gives soil a crust that prevents seed contact with moisture. When ash falls and is followed by rain, it turns into a paste that suffocates roots and clogs irrigation channels. Livestock, bewildered by tainted water and slick pasture, weaken and die. The Food and Agriculture Organization warns that ashfall can devastate crops and grazing depending on thickness and timing, and that the secondary effects, contaminated feed and water, often do as much damage as the dust itself. Our granaries are full of grain rendered useless by ash and mold. The silos still stand, but their contents will not lift the bread again. Health is a quiet war here. Volcanic ash is not sterile. It carries glassy, sharp particles and absorbed gases that irritate eyes and lungs. People cough like old engines no matter their age. Chronic exposure brings bronchitis and worsened outcomes for asthma, and acute exposures can incapacitate. The Centers for Disease Control has been blunt on this point for years. Wear respirators, keep the windows sealed when ash falls, and avoid driving where visibility is poor because ash makes everything slippery and treacherous. In our town, we learned these rules the hard way, through the slow attrition of lungs and the lost sprint to a clinic that either shut or ran out of oxygen. The eruption rewired the weather systems. The aerosols didn't just cool. They changed atmospheric circulation, altered rainfall, and in some places suppressed winds. That has knock-on effects we hadn't accounted for. Areas that used to get reliable seasonal rains went dry. Other places got rain too late and too acidic. The precipitation laced with particles that tired the soil into a state of acid imbalance. The result: harvests shrink, pest pressures change, water tables drop in some basins and become toxic in others. We can point to historical precedent, the Tambora eruption and the so-called year without a summer of 1816, to see how climate shocks cascade into crop failures and social unrest. What happened back then was a taste of what a large eruption can do. What we're facing is larger in breadth and layered on top of an already stressed climate system. Survival is harder every day because the infrastructure that used to smooth shocks is gone. Supply lines are severed. Fuel is a rumor you check twice a week. The high-voltage grid is down in long stretches. Transformers are melted and feeders clogged with ash. Trucks once delivered seed and spare parts. Now they are targets or simply don't have the diesel to run. That means tractors stay idle, pumps stop, and refrigeration fails. When you lose refrigeration, medicine spoils. Antibiotics that would have been the difference between life and death go sour in heat-logged boxes. When pumps die, wells stagnate or fail. When pumps fail and surface water is tainted with ash and runoff, disease finds a way in. The technical explanation is ugly. The systems we relied on are linear and brittle. Once a few nodes fail, the whole network frays. On a human level, the crisis rewrites social contracts. Governments attempted to respond at first, advisories, rationing, temporary shelters, but the strain was too great and the goodwill too short. Emergency services ran until their fuel did not. Some local administrations held together where small communities could self-organize. Elsewhere, power vacuums turned into fiefdoms. We now have enclaves that attempt to govern through barter and a strict code, raider bands that survive on speed and cruelty, and lone scavengers who will trade secrets for food. People form groups because safety in numbers still works. Patrols, watch schedules, water-sharing pacts. But groups require resources and trust, and both are in short supply. The tension between communal cooperation and predatory survivalism is one of the central dramas of our days. I have seen both sides. I once traded a spool of copper wire for a crate of bottled water with a community that had set up solar panels and a cistern. They asked for maintenance logs and my list of spare parts in exchange. Honesty keeps you alive sometimes. Another time, a group passed through, hard-eyed, well-armed, and demanded we hand over the transmitter. They believed controlling the airwaves meant controlling the truth, and therefore the people. I refused, and we paid in a raid that left my porch full of boot prints and my neighbor's shed burned. Those encounters sharpen you. You learn to read people the way you read the sky, by subtle change and by the silence that follows. Resources are the arithmetic of our collapse. Water tops the list. Clean water is a commodity more precious than gold. Wells that drew for a town 3 months ago now taste of metal. Runoff from ash fields loads them with particulate and dissolved compounds. Our basic water treatment is primitive. Settle, filter through cloth and charcoal, then disinfect with bleach when we have it. Boiling helps for biological contaminants, but not for the fine mineral dust that abrades lungs. We ration water for drinking, cooking, and hygiene with cruel specificity. 2 liters a person a day is luxury in many places. When rain comes, we dance like the old Sunday churchgoers. I have seen whole neighborhoods spill into the streets to capture drops into anything that holds it. Practical advice: catch rainwater in dark, covered barrels. Allow ash to settle before filtering. Use layered cloth and charcoal to remove particulates, and add a measured amount of household bleach when available to disinfect. When you can, prioritize clean water for infants and the sick. The rest can be used for washing and irrigation if you have to. Short, specific tactics like filtering, settling, and disinfection are practical and borrowed from established emergency guidance. Food is the second ledger. Crops fail or are unsafe after heavy ash. We eat what can be gathered, canned goods scavenged from supermarkets, roots dug from marginal gardens, the occasional cache of rice someone forgot. Preservation is an art. Drying fruit, smoking meat over low heat, and sealing food in oilcloth or lacquered tins. Seed is now one of the most valuable currencies. A single packet of non-hybrid, open-pollinated seed can support a family for years if managed properly. Community seed banks are emerging in places where trust exists. They are guarded like treasures, and they are also our hope. But even seeds need water and sunlight, and both are thin on the ground. Fuel is the final nightmare. Diesel runs generators, gasoline moves the food, propane saves a kitchen. We hoard it and treat it like oxygen. Without fuel, nothing moves. I barter for a gallon when I can. Cigarettes, parts, a favor owed. That barter economy creates its own inequities and violence. Solar helps where panels survived the ash and people knew how to hook them up. But panels are vulnerable to particulates and need inverters and batteries someone must maintain. The ash reduces the efficiency of renewable installations and the cooling of their electronics. In some places, wind potential falls because the climate shifts, change wind patterns. These are technical details that turn into human scarcity. Here's also the slow erasure of knowledge. Libraries of data, servers, cloud backups were not built to survive in particulate-choked boxes and without stable cooling. The people who knew how to fix certain machines died or moved on. Knowledge that used to be 3 clicks away is now a conversation with an elder who remembers the schematic of an inverter. That makes recovery protracted and local. We patch what we can. We cannibalize old appliances for capacitors and coils. We keep scrapbooks of instructions: how to strip copper, how to test a relay, how to sew a filter that traps dust without constricting airflow. This low-tech knowledge is now as crucial as maps. Scientifically, the lethal cocktail here is combinatorial. The eruption delivered particulates and sulfurous gases. Sulfur turned into reflective sulfate aerosols that cooled the surface and altered precipitation. The ash physically damaged crops and infrastructure, while acid deposition altered soil chemistry. Reduced sunlight lowers photosynthesis and shortens growing seasons. At the same time, the physical and chemical burden of ash destroys seedlings. Human systems, supply chains, electrical grids, public health networks were not resilient enough for a simultaneous hit on climate and infrastructure. That combination turned an environmental shock into a sustained humanitarian crisis. For context and grounding, Researchers and agencies that study volcanic impacts and disaster response have documented how aerosols scatter solar radiation and can cool the climate for years, how ash harms agriculture, and how communities best protect health through masks and water treatment. Actionable things to do. Things I say on air because people need not just a chronicle but a set of moves, are small and immediate. Seal your living space when ash falls. Use N95 respirators if you must go outside, and craft layered cloth masks as a lesser option. Capture and store rainwater, but let ash settle and filter before drinking. Conserve fuel and prioritize its use for water and medical needs. Share knowledge. Teach one other how to test a battery, how to seal a cistern, how to patch a radio. We also need to watch the weather and the ash columns. A cloud on the horizon is not scenery. It is a threat level. Information is leverage. A community that shares its intel survives better than one that hoards it. This is the crisis we live with now. An atmosphere thick with memory, a landscape re-etched by ash and loss, and people rearranging themselves into whatever social forms can hold water and stories. There are no easy fixes. The science tells us what is happening. The politics and the human choices decide whether we fracture further or find a way to knit small, resilient systems together. I talk into the microphone and give coordinates and schedules and masks and water advice because telling people what to do, small, concrete things, buys time. Time is the commodity we now trade in. Time to adapt, to reroute, to keep a child from dying of a preventable infection. Time might not save everything, but it makes the difference between a life that is only survived and one that is worth living. They told me once that crises don't arrive like storms. You don't always see the black cloud coming. Mostly, they arrive like attrition, 100 small failures that, when stacked together, become a catastrophe. That's how this phase started. Not with a single headline, but with one more empty barrel in the yard, one more night with the generator coughing for less than usual, one more caller who begged me to announce the coordinates of a well that didn't exist anymore. The ash kept falling, but the shape of the danger shifted. The winter of dim light had turned the land brittle. The brittle made people desperate. Desperation made rules bend. Food stores, already threadbare, began to thin to the edge of a knife. Where I used to trade a spool of copper for a crate of water, I now had to give 2 spools and a promise. The locals tightened their belts. We moved our meager stockpiles into basements and buried them under quilts because rats learned faster than we did, and because sometimes neighbors turned into strangers overnight. Water disappeared in ways that felt almost personal. One morning the cistern had 2 inches less than it ought to. Another day I watched a black-plumed vehicle crawl past the house, and I knew it was the same convoy that had taken from the east outpost last month. They had a system. Scout at dawn, mark a target, and return at dusk. They called themselves the Hawks. Everyone else called them thieves. We mounted simple alarms, tripwires that rattled tins, noisemakers we assembled from cans and nails. They kept people awake, which was both their blessing and curse. Sleep deprivation phrased judgment. Still, the alarms bought seconds. Seconds matter. Fuel God fuel was a ledger of shame. The generator ran less willingly. Batteries held less charge. I had to ration airtime. Where I once kept the station warm for 6 hours each evening, now I granted the microphone 2 community hours, then powered down to preserve the cell that fed the emergency radio. Every time the transmitter came alive, it felt like a small rebellion. Listeners wrote to say, "Don't go quiet," and their shorthand became my tether. Raiders adapted. In the early months they were clumsy and loud, and we could outmaneuver them. Later they learned to whisper promises as easily as they learned to crack locks. A new type, organized, efficient, almost corporate in their cruelty, began to circulate. They took the roofs of the less careful enclaves and sold them to other enclaves with a markup of terror. They moved in convoys of welded metal and fresh leather. They wore masks that kept the ash off their faces but hid the softness of humanity. I had a close call one night when they came through the valley. They stopped at the general store across the river, bought some canned peaches with one hand, and took a crate of medicines with the other. A man I had bartered with days before, Tom, who had a laugh like a pocket watch, was taken in the confusion. I never saw him again. I filed his name into the log and read it on air like an obituary. Amid the depletion and the predation, rumors spread, because rumor is what fills the vacuum when science and supply fail. The best rumors are hopeful. They trade like contraband. Early on it was a whisper, Green Hollow, a valley somewhere northwest where the ash hadn't settled like a blanket and where a river ran clear. Later, other names surfaced, Clearwater Ridge, the Well of 10 Trees. They sounded like the sort of myth someone would make up to survive. But a rumor seated in enough mouths has gravity. It draws attention. It draws people. And when people move, others either follow or prey upon them. The report that shifted the balance for me came on a frost-silvered morning. A traveler arrived, thin, wrapped in too many layers, hitching a cart with a dead dog in the back. She had a radio in a woven satchel, and she had dirty fingerprints that told me she'd been through a dozen hands. She came to the cabin with a question on her lips and a look that said she had not expected an answer. I poured water into a dented mug and offered it, because politeness is currency too. She said her name was Mara, and she had heard a broadcast from a station up north that mentioned a spring. They gave coordinates and a rough description, a canyon with green moss and a pump that still worked. She traveled for weeks following that coordinate until the map dissolved into ash, and the people around her told conflicting tales. People guard hope like treasure and sometimes bury it in secrets. Mara had run out of secrets to hoard. Trust is a problem with teeth in it. I asked her for details. She confessed she had snuck away from an enclave that had tried to recruit her as a scout. She didn't want to go back because she had seen how scouts were fed into raids or used to draw maps for more predatory groups. I believed her because her hands shook while she spoke, and because people who tell lies usually keep them tidy. She produced a scrap of paper with coordinates scrawled in a messy hand and a small map drawn with the kind of landmarks that survive when others have failed. A burnt water tower, a leaning silo, a church bell hung by a rope. It was not proof, but it was a place to start. The temptation to follow burned in me like a fever, but I had the station. I had the log. I had the trust of people who depended on my voice for warnings and for the small kindness of being remembered. To leave meant abandoning a radio someone could claim and abuse. To stay meant watching the cistern dry and the stocks thin. I argued with myself for days in private counsel. Stay and maintain the node of information, or go and try to secure a resource that, if real, could change the ledger for 100 families. Mara told stories of small enclaves along the way. A schoolhouse where old men were growing radishes beneath plastic. A factory where the workers welded a wind turbine that hummed in the mornings. A monastery that had rerouted a spring into stone troughs. Sometimes the stories ended with people smiling. Sometimes they ended with bodies. Stories in this time are both map and caution. On the radio, I read parts of Mara's map during one of the short broadcasts we could afford. People called in with corrections and curses and pieces. We camped near a leaning silo last summer. It's south of your coordinate. Another caller said, "Don't go, hawks were there last month." The chorus of voices became a chorus of warnings and enticements. The air was full of conflicting vectors. That is how tension knits itself, through choices that have no good outcome and through information that is simultaneously a lifeline and a lure. I felt it every time I turned the transmitter on. Someone might hear of the spring and make for it. Someone else might hear and realize it was a trap. There were stories, true ones, of wells used as bait. Raiders would mark a pump and then wait for people to come and then take both the pump and the people. Information was odious in how it could be both gift and death. While rumors bent into plans, nature tightened its grip. The ash clouds thickened again for a week, turning the days to dusk. A wind shift brought a rotten smell and small glassy particles that sanded down the edges of metal. We lost more shade when the trees that had stubbornly persisted snapped under the burden. Mice and rats proliferated in the dark nooks where canned goods were stored. Fleas and lice embroidered skin. Cases of respiratory illness climbed, and the makeshift clinic's supply of antibiotics dipped perilously low. The doctor there, Alina, who used to teach middle school, sent messages every other day asking for bandages and acetaminophen. I read her plea on air and the cabin hummed like a hive. People offered what they could. A roll of gauze here, a bottle of syrup there. These were small kindnesses, but kindness is currency too. Human choices mattered even more than weather. A nearby enclave had decided to stockpile food by taking it from the less defended stores. They fortified themselves with barbed wire and concrete blocks fashioned into walls. I watched their young men parade once, painted faces, clean knives, and I could not help but see our old world's uniforms reassembled as costumes for predation. They believed security came from hoarding, and hoarding draws enemies like iron draws rust. I broadcast warnings. Avoid the eastern road at dusk. A week later, a patrol came through the valley bearing children in need. They'd escaped the fortress and had nothing but the clothes on their backs. I took them in for 2 nights, gave them sugar that tasted like old summers, and watched them cough in my doorway. They slept. I wondered how long the sleep would hold. So the pressure mounted, more mouths, less food, more convoys, less fuel, more rumor, more movement. The station's logs filled with coordinates and pleas and obituaries. In the margins I scribbled strategies, alternate watch schedules, barter lists, a route that avoided the eastern fortress. I taught people simple engineering fixes over the air, how to seal a cistern with oilcloth and resin, how to jury-rig a filter with layers of cloth and charcoal, how to check a battery's charge with a voltmeter and a load test. Giving people knowledge felt dangerous sometimes, but more often it felt like a way to democratize survival. Information is power. Sometimes it is protection rather than bait. But I am human and flawed. I began to imagine the Green Valley as a cure-all. Nights when sleep would not come, I would pull Mara's map from a drawer and trace the route with a finger. I would tell myself a story of arriving with a cart full of parts and leaving with a pump and a cistern and a convoy of grateful faces. The fantasy softened the ache of Claire's absence and the dull, constant hunger in my belly. Hope, when it becomes a plan, can do strange things to a person. It becomes a vector for courage and a vector for error. A week passed. Supplies dipped. The hawks struck again, moving like vultures, taking from enclaves farther inland. They killed a man 2 valleys over when he refused to show the location of a hidden cistern. The radio caught his wife's scream when she found his body. I broadcast the names of the dead, because naming them was the last defense against them vanishing into the ledger of things we lost. Each name read felt like an accusation against the world and an anchor to memory. Then Mara came to me one night with a decision on her face. She had spent the day repairing an old water pump with parts scavenged from a tractor. "We can try," she said. "I've got a route that avoids the eastern road. We can go at dusk and be hidden by the ash. If it's a lie, we come back. If it's real, we bring water." Her hands did not stop moving. She stitched the last of the gaskets into a spring and then tucked it away like a prayer. I hesitated. The station would go dark if I left too long. The hawks had eyes and ears. My absence could be an invitation. But there are moments in living when the ledger tilts and the only rational thing is to gamble. I thought of Alina's clinic and the queue of coughing children. I thought of Tom's lost laugh. I thought of the children who wrote to say they were listening and had never seen a blue sky. I thought of Claire and how she used to say that we owed the dead a life that was not only survived but worth telling about. So we made a plan. A small group, Mara, me, 2 of the caravan children who had learned how to fix tires, and a retired mechanic named Barrow would go at dusk. We would take only what we could carry and leave everything else as a decoy. We would travel light, move through the ash that muffled sound, and follow Mara's landmarks. We would be back before the generator's battery dipped below threshold. It was a plan built of epsilon advantages and stubborn hope. It was also a decision that would change everything. When you stand at the edge of a decision that might be salvation or suicide, you feel something like a physical split. The world rearranges into possibility and consequence. You do the math, and the math often points to ruin. You do the math, and you also know that staying sometimes equals a slow suffocation. The rising action was not just the loss of supplies or the raids. It was the pressure of choice. It was the way our small dramas, Mara's map, Tom's disappearance, the Hawks' parade, converged into a single vector that asked me, will you stay to light a small lamp, or will you carry that lamp up a mountain that may not exist? We set out at dusk, an echo of sky and ash at our heels, a plan taped to the inside of my jacket. The radio's light blinked twice and then went dark, and the cabin felt suddenly too large and too empty. I pedaled one last time and stored the battery in a tin. I whispered into the microphone, listen for us. If you hear nothing, assume the worst and be careful. Then we walked into a night that smelled like metal and old rain, and the rising action pulled us forward like a tide. The canyon opened like a promise and like a threat, the scrub giving way to a green so bright it made my throat ache. After days of ash and monochrome, seeing moss was like finding a lost color. We followed Mara's map until the landmarks she described. An iron water tower stuck in a lean, a silo with its head knocked off, suddenly lined up. The air smelled different there, wet and mineral with a hint of iron. We slowed, each of us listening for the small sound that could betray a pump, the thunk of metal, the sigh of water settling into a cistern. At first it was almost gentle, a trickle behind a curtain of roots. Then Barrow found the pipe, half buried, threaded into stone, and for a second I thought my chest would split open with the want of it. The pump was old and hand-cranked, a relic someone had kept alive like a prayer. Moss clung to the stone like a child's promises. Mara cried quietly and wiped her face with the back of her hand. The children laughed and then coughed, the sound rough with ash but bright with the absurdity of joy. We worked fast. Barrow set to cleaning the intake while I checked the seals. The pump gave up a sputter, and then a thin column of water came, clear enough to make me swallow with the taste of hope. We bottled what we could in the few tins and canteens we'd carried. I filled my palms and let the water run between my fingers as if testing whether it was real. It was. The sound of it on metal made a music I had not heard in months. We should have known then that triumph makes you lazy. Maybe it was pride or exhaustion, but we did not take proper watch. We did not string a perimeter or post 2 quiet scouts to the ridge. We celebrated the way people do when they have been starved for small mercies. We laughed, we ate a bit. We patched the pump enough to keep working. Mara made tea. She brewed it on a tiny stove while the children ran their hands into the river and came back with wet, laughing faces. The first warning came as a whisper, Barrow's hand on my shoulder, his eyes fixed on something behind us. He hissed a name that I recognized from my logs, Hawks. I felt the word like a punch. The green blurred. We moved like it hurt. They were only a few, 2 trucks and a half-dozen riders, but well-armed and methodical. They cut the valley's single approach in 2, and then dismounted like they'd practiced 1,000 times. They wore the same black leather masks I'd seen on their videos, but in the daylight, you could see the rust on their boots and the sun-faded tattoos. Their leader had a voice that sounded like gravel over a bell when he barked orders. He spoke of rights and claiming, as if that gave theft a legal robe. Hands where we can see them, he said. It should have been a trivial line, but it landed with the weight of a history. Mara stepped forward, foolish, brave, and tried to talk. She told them the pump was ours by right of need. The leader smiled like a man who had heard every excuse and kept a sharper appetite for concessions. He wanted the pump. He wanted every part of it, but more than that he wanted to announce on the air that he controlled the water. He wanted to take control of not just the pump but the story of it. That's when I understood the calculus they had been running. Control of water was less useful if people still whispered a different truth across the hills. A pump without a narrative can be a secret. A pump with a microphone behind it becomes a banner. I could see the logic in their eyes. If they could force me to broadcast their claim, they could make 100 enclaves bow. I felt the station inside my chest like a second heartbeat. I could have handed it over. I could have promised them my frequency for the rest of my life. What would that have bought us? A few barrels, safety for a week, the humiliation of surrender forever after. But it would have bought blood too. Concessions have a way of taking more than they pay. My fingers closed around the little tin that held the last battery cell for the transmitter. The weight of it told me everything I needed to know. There are moments when you can tell the whole world has stopped to watch what you do next. For me, that moment was that long. My body decided faster than my head. I would use the radio. It was a stupid, dangerous idea. Broadcasting would put a bell on our heads. But it was also leverage. If they wanted the narrative, I would give them a narrative that cost them something greater. I hauled the battery from my coat and set up the transmitter under the lip of a boulder, out of sight. The hawks were close enough now that I could hear the clink of their gear. My palms shook as I hooked the wires. The generator back at the cabin hummed in my memory. A loyal animal. Here, all I had was a little cell and a hand crank I could not reach. The battery was enough for one long transmission and maybe a few short pings afterward. I keyed the mic. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. I should have mumbled a surrender and promised the world. Instead, I spoke a sentence I had practiced on the walk in a twisted lullaby to Claire. This is Harrington. This frequency is for the people. You will not speak for them. The leader laughed, a hollow sound. Then die saying it, he said, and stepped closer, his men forming an arc like the teeth of a trap. I broadcast a lie and a truth together. I told the hills that a convoy bearing reinforcements, 3 vehicles heavy with people, was on its way and would approach from the western pass in 20 minutes. It was a fabrication, but I had learned that radio bears authority. An announced schedule can override suspicion if delivered right. After I made the call, my voice dropped into the sort of cadence that makes truth out of words, and it slipped into static. I then keyed the transmitter to broadcast an old distressed tone on a loop behind my voice, a sound I knew would carry and force attention. I'd learned tricks, short bursts of tone followed by voice, enough to make any listening station think something urgent was happening. The leader froze for a sliver of time, and in that sliver I saw a calculation cross his face. Raiders live on advantage. An approaching convoy, even worried and empty, changes advantage. He signaled his men. They moved like a single thing toward the trucks, eager to get to the road and his imagined reinforcements. He barked an order to leave a small party to guard the pump. The party that stayed tried not to look like fear. They left 2 men. 2 meant we would not be overwhelmed by surveillance, but it meant we still had to act like thieves of our own luck. Mara and Barrow moved like trained hands. Barrow faked a wrench slip and then tossed a bolt like a prayer. He and I wrenched the pump loose from the anchor points and manhandled the barrel and the intake. The children filled the cans while Mara stood watch. It was clumsy and human and perfect. We loaded what we could, 2 full barrels and 3 smaller drums, then stacked them on a makeshift sled. I wanted to run, to pull the water away from the canyon and back toward the valley, but as I turned I saw the 2 guards looking at me in a way that meant suspicion had shifted into certainty. One of them had a rifle. He raised it and fired at a trajectory meant to wound more than kill Callus, intended to terrify. The pellet struck Barrow in the shoulder. He dropped with a curse and a sound like a breaking tree. The canister skidded free. Blood went on dust and looked like something obscene. Barrow cursed and tried to move anyway. I felt rage like a live wire. I should have run at them like a fool. I should have tried to grab the shooter. Instead, I heard something in the distance like the sound of feet on gravel. And the imaginary convoy I had broadcast became a real movement. They came from the ridge, 3 trucks, not ours, not the Hawks. The leader of the convoy shouted orders and his voice carried. "Stand down. This frequency belongs to the people. We'll take the water back to the valley." For a second, I thought the world had rearranged itself. Then another voice answered, and the second voice was not with the convoy but with the hawks, shouting that the reinforcements were a lie. The valley became a theater of echoes. In the chaos, the hawks did what predators do. They struck where advantage shifted. The two guards lunged, trying to claim the barrels. I had choices. I could stay and defend. I could flee with the children and leave Barrow and Mara. Or I could do something stupider. I could use the transmitter's last juice to make a final broadcast that would call people in the valley to act. Something that would rally not just our small band, but others who trusted the sound of my voice. I chose stupid and necessary. I cranked the battery into place and spoke in a voice that was not mine but became mine under the weight of everything. "Harrington here. This channel is a call. To anyone within sound, help us take back what is ours. Do not let them take the well." The battery blinked and then died. The signal dropped into static, a last fervent prayer. At that sound, my sound, something changed. The convoys and groups and scattered farmers and kids on watch in nearby folds heard it. They came because they could not do nothing. People are like that. Hearing a voice is a summons. The hawks, confronted with other bodies in barns and men I recognized from my logbook, realized they had overplayed their hand. Their leader cursed and shouted, and his attention fractured as other actors entered. The new arrivals' trucks were filled with people I knew. Elena's clinic crew, a small brigade of men who had once been mechanics, a father who'd lost his daughter to coughs and now had a rifle in his hands that shook. There was fighting, but it was not the cinematic madness you see in films. It was the cruel, noisy ballet of people who have been stretched too thin. Shouts, a broken lantern, a hand wrenching free from a truck, someone falling and then getting up. In the end, the hawks retreated. Their leader cursed and spit and mounted his truck. They left some men behind, captured by communities who wanted them alive for the simple reason that justice in this new world required testimony. And their trucks were lighter for having grabbed the smaller prizes. We moved the barrels back into a hidden hollow near the pump. Barrow's shoulder was a red, damp thing that would scar. He refused a tourniquet until he saw the surgeon's hands, Elena's hands, test the pulse and sting the wound with alcohol. I sat on a rock and let the ash settle on my knees. My transmitter was a silent tin in my pack. The battery was gone. My voice felt smaller but also broader, as if the sacrifice had turned it into a bridge. That night, people gathered around the pump like worshippers. They drank water like it was a sacrament, and the children dipped their faces in the stream. We shared bread and broken jerky. We laughed in that brittle way survivors laugh, loud and sharp and a little crazed. I thought of Claire. I thought of the convoy that had taken her. I thought of the man Tom, whose laugh had left an empty pocket on my logbook. And I thought of the radio, dark under my arm, a relic that had done what it needed to do. I had lost the transmitter's battery, and along with it, the easy power of voice. But the broadcast had done what I had hoped. It had put me into a ledger that was not mine alone. The valley learned that a single signal could sew together 1,000 small acts. People who had not trusted each other now looked at each other with a shared calculus. This pump could force cooperation if guarded and shared. They argued late into the night about watches and rations, and how to guard against the hawks returning. They argued with the flat human stubbornness that still, somehow, keeps us from dissolving. I lay that night thinking of trade-offs and bargains. I had been willing to hold onto my microphone like an idol, and then I used it to send a lie and a call that saved water for many. The transmitter would be repairable. Barrow could salvage cells, someone would trade wire, but the battery's gone. The loss is painful because in a world of shortages, a radio is more than a tool. It is a covenant. I had burned my covenant to feed people. There is a reckoning in that. People will call me reckless and some will call me a saint in private. I prefer not to be either. I am someone who made a choice. I had to decide, again and again, what I would carry forward. The canyon had given us water and taken something in return. That is the ledger of this life. Every gain comes with a cost, every rescue with a wound. Tonight, the pump sings gently and the children sleep by its sound. I will wake and write the day's log and list the names of those who came and those who did not. I will heal Barrow's shoulder with linens and boiled water and a tincture that smells of old medicine. The climax ended not with a clean victory but with a complicated relief. We had water, and the cost had been heavy. We had a new responsibility. The pump would not be a prize to hoard but a commons to guard. We would have to learn to share without becoming vulnerable, to build a perimeter without building a fortress. My radio was quiet now, but my voice had been heard. That is the hard, simple currency of survival, to save what you can and pay what you must. The canyon kept its secret but did not keep it all to itself. In the days after the raid, water became the measure by which we judged trust. The pump's small song, metal on metal, a shallow human cadence, became the center of our life. People rotated watches, built low stone walls to shield the intake from runoff, and established a schedule. Mornings for the clinic and the elders, afternoons for irrigation and storage, evenings for communal use. We argued over distribution, as you always do when scarcity checks your principles. We negotiated, and sometimes we lost, but mostly we learned to account for each other. Barrow healed in the stretch of time you might call slow or merciful, depending on how you prefer to name pain. Alina sewed his shoulder with sure hands and old experience. The infection never took hold. He will walk crooked for a while, and the scar will be a map of the canyon's cost, but he jokes now about the hawks and their bad aim. Humor is fragile here, but it is also defiant. We needed defiance more than sermon. The children washed with water that smelled faintly of iron, and slept like they had finally been given permission to be small again. We built watchtowers out of pallets and scavenged lumber. The kids, quiet, fast learners, ran ropes and learned to listen for the subtle change in wind that means a convoy is near. We trained them to move like shadows when necessary, to hide barrels in dugaways so that if someone came looking they would find nothing. The pump's protection became a test of cooperation. Could a dozen households bind their petty grievances and grudges together into a single purpose? We found that sometimes they could. The need to keep the well meant the woman who had cursed me for my blunt tone became the same woman who patched my jacket in a rainless dawn. The hawks did not come back immediately. For a time the valley breathed as if it had been granted a reprieve. But reprieves in this world are always temporary. The radio's silence was a shadow that crept along the edges of our conversations. Without the transmitter humming in the background, without that ritual of voice, something in the valley felt less anchored. People still told stories of what the signal had once done, how it had brought strangers to help, how it had been used as a bluff and then a call that changed the calculus of the raid. The battery was gone. The transmitter was portable, but power is a sacrament here, and we had used it up. I felt the absence like a tooth pulled. That absence forced change. Before the canyon, I had been a node that distributed information from one place. After, I became part of a mesh. People set up their own small repeaters, scrappy sets of wires and coils and tubes, so they could talk at short distances without a central hymn. It is less elegant and less far-reaching, but it is harder to seize. We learned to speak in code phrases for movement and to trust in trusted faces. I still spoke sometimes into the cabin's dormant mic, but less as an authority and more as a correspondent. The hierarchy flattened. I liked and feared that. Emotionally, the aftermath was a calculus of grief and recompense. I had burned my covenant, the battery, to call folks in, to lie about a convoy, to disrupt the hawk's logic. The battery was a small sacrament of voice. It had been my anchor, the thing that made my words reverberate beyond the immediate hill. Losing it felt like losing a limb and like gaining a scar. The complaints were quiet and sharp. Some people said I had been reckless. Others said I'd been brave. The truth sits between those extremes. I had used a resource I could not replace to win a fight that could have been lost. I will live with that decision, because living with decisions is the new currency. I thought a lot about Claire in the weeks that followed, not because her ghost demanded it, but because absence has a way of gathering like dust in the corners of the mind. I wondered if she would have wanted me to stay, to broadcast, to use the radio as both bait and trumpet. I think she would have cursed at my romanticism, and then made me a cup of coffee anyway. Memory, I've learned, is not a static shrine. It is a tool you sharpen and then put in the shared kit. I used Claire's memory as one of those tools, a reason for making risky choices when children cough and someone else can save them. Nature did small, peculiar things after the pump came. The moss that had clung to the canyon stone expanded like a rumor. Small birds returned and argued with each other over the last of the thorn bushes. Insects that had seemed gone reappeared, a timid, nervous army. These were not signs of a wide recovery, far from it, but they were local miracles, little reversals of the ash's erasure. We counted them like coins. A week after the pump's bounty, a hint of algae appeared in shallow pools. Someone somewhere put it into a pot and grew a small experimental tray of seedlings. The sprouts were scrawny and suspicious of the light, but they were green and therefore dangerous in the best possible way. They gave us plans, but the ash remained. Sometimes the sky turned a strange, bruised color for days at a time. A wind would come from the northwest and disperse a film of dust that made everything taste like old metal. We had to guard the cistern against contamination and keep the inlet covered during ashfall. Even with the pump, our water strategy was delicate. We set aside reserves for the clinic and infants. We rationed for irrigation, and we made rules harsh enough to keep thieves uninterested. The world had not forgiven us. It was merely offering small, precarious checks. The social fabric of the valley had shifted. Where once I had been a kind of solitary recorder, filing coordinates, repeating names, I now found myself involved in governance. There's no glory in that. Governance here is a sequence of small cruelties and mercies, deciding who gets how many liters of water on a bad day, negotiating whether a watchman may use a rifle in defense, mediating disputes about whether a family hoarding canned peaches deserves punishment or aid. I am not trained for rule. I am trained to tell stories. Yet someone had to keep the ledger and enforce the rules because anarchy eats itself fast in a place of scarcity. We set up a council. It had no mandate but had consensus. Elena kept the medical logs. Barrow handled the pumps and the hardware. A woman named Jessa, who had once been a school secretary, kept the books, such as they were, and recorded births and deaths and promises made. I read the ledger sometimes on air when I could, because the act of reading the names made them more than ink. It made them accountable. People came to council meetings and argued, and sometimes they cried. The meetings were long and full of the small violences that come with living together in stress. But they were also where we decided to save a packet of seeds for spring, and where we voted to send a scout caravan to the south to reclaim a cache of fuel. In the quiet moments, when the children were asleep and the watch rotated like a careful clock, I walked to the pump and listened. Water is never only water. It is memory and instrument and bargaining chip and mercy. I put my palm in its flow and let the coldness crawl into my skin. The action felt like an apology. I apologized sometimes out loud for the lies I broadcasted and for the battery I burned. People accepted my apology as you accept weather. You make room for it and then keep moving. The landscape outside the canyon continued to ache. Fields remained patchwork gray. Towns still showed the silhouettes of their better years. Bridges sagged where supports had been eaten by rain and ash. The highways were fractured and used more for walking than driving. Yet the pump had become a node in a network that might, slowly, knit itself into something resilient. We shared strategies over trimmed copper wires and baked the last of a loaf that tasted more like grit than before, but nonetheless fed 15 mouths. We had fewer adrenaline spikes when the hawks were near, but the threat remained. People planned a fortified escort for future salvage runs and practiced turning over trucks so they could be moved quickly. My identity shifted. I had been a keeper of stories. Now I was a keeper of things, schedules, rations, small legalities. I did not like the title, but I accepted the work. I found that holding the ledger and reading the names on air had its own kind of intimacy and responsibility. I found compassion for the man who had taken pills from a clinic to feed his child, because hunger forces choices we cannot imagine until we are hungry. I found clarity in the cruelty. The hawks will return if we make it easy, so we make it hard. There are days when I wake with the weight of the canyon on my chest, and other days when I wake with the laughter of children on my tongue. Those moments of laughter keep me upright. The pump is also a test of whether we can be good without being naive. We must be watchful and charitable in equal measure. We must teach young people to be wary, but not to close themselves off to the possibility of strangers with empty hands. As for the radio, it waits like an old friend with a bandaged mouth. The transmitter can be rebuilt in time. Barrow can salvage cells and someone will trade wire, but the way we use radio has changed. We will be more cautious, more local in our broadcasts, and more dependent on networks of trust. My voice has been humbled by its own consequences. It has been both a weapon and a balm. When I look at the ledger now, it is a study in small triumphs and long deficits. We have water. We have a clinic that can patch and stitch. We have seedlings that might, if the ash allows, become a patch of food. But we also have debts. To people we could not save, to nights when we did not have a battery, to those who called me reckless. I carry them like bandoliers, heavy and useful. Hope exists here, but it is not naive. It is an economy. We invest in seeds and watches and a child's education because hope compounds when tended. We are not healed. The world is not repaired. The sky still bears the memory of that eruption like a scar. But there are places where life insists, like green fingers pushing through concrete. Those are the places we guard and guard fiercely, because they are small, and small is where survival happens now. I will keep writing the log. I will keep teaching how to seal a cistern, and how to stitch a respirator mask from layers of cloth. I will keep reading names into the air, because names make us accountable to each other. The canyon taught me that some bargains are worth burning for. It taught me, too, that no victory is complete without the work that follows. Tonight, the pump hums, children sleep, and Barrow jokes about his crooked walk. The sky hangs low, but the moss wins in the cracks. The falling action is not a falling at all, but a settling into the new ledger of life. There will be more raids, more shortages, more choices. There will also be small uprisings of kindness and ingenuity. We have water now, and water buys us a fraction of tomorrow. That is enough to keep us moving, for now. The canyon taught me a lesson I had not wanted to learn. Hope is not an event. It's a responsibility. It's a cheap, fragile thing that demands tending, and a costly thing that sometimes asks to be burned so others might live. We burned a battery and kept water in people's hands. We lost a luxury of voice and gained a communal drumbeat of watches and seed plans. That's the shape of our bargains now, small, consequential, and imperfect. When I walk the perimeter at dawn, the light is thin and wrong, as it has been for years. The pump glints like a small promise. Children run past with bare feet and coughs that will not leave them for weeks, but their faces are bright in a way that matters more than anything the old world offered. They do not know what we lost in full, and perhaps that is mercy. They know only that water exists and that there are people who will stand in the cold to keep it flowing. That is enough to make them brave. I think of Claire in the quiet. Memory is not a single thing. It is a lever and a map. It has pushed me toward risk sometimes and steadied me other times. I do not glorify sacrifice. There is nothing cinematic about living through cold gray days and the slow failure of things. But I will say this. Grief deepens competency. Where loss cuts, it also fertilizes a stubborn will to arrange the world in ways that save others. On practical terms, the fight continues. We must keep guarding the pump and the cistern. We must teach a dozen more hands to repair seals and pumps. We must prioritize infants and the sick when water's thin, and keep a rationing ledger that is hard but fair. We must train scouts who move like the wind and teach kids how to recognize a convoy's pattern. We will continue to mend solar panels with scavenged diodes, and to teach anyone who will listen how to build a charcoal filter and stitch a multi-layered respirator. These are small technologies of survival, not glamorous, but they keep us breathing. The radio will be repaired. It is not dead. It only needs parts and time and the kindness of someone who trades a spool of wire for a story. Even without it, our little mesh of repeaters and face-to-face packs proved something crucial. Communication can survive decentralization. People will set up their own frequencies, their own schedules. We will be quieter, less centralized, harder to silence. That is an ugly, beautiful resilience, ugly because born of loss, beautiful because it refuses to be owned. I am not naive about what comes next. The hawks will not vanish because we want them to. The ash will not lift because we scold the sky. There will be more nights when the generator sputters and the clinic runs low, more seasons when seedlings die under a thin film of gray. Climate shocks ripple, infrastructure rebuilds in fits, human appetite adapts and sometimes hardens. We will have to be deliberate in building redundancy, seeds stored in different places, water caches micro-distributed, multiple people trained in medicine and mechanics. Redundancy is humankind's answer to fragility, but I have also learned that small things compound. A pump in a canyon does not fix the world, but it feeds a child who then has the strength to learn to repair a pump. A single battery burned in a bluff bought water, and a network of people who now know they can act together. A lie announced on the air, used to bluff away thieves, became a real call for aid that showed how sound could assemble a force for good. None of these are moral absolutes. All of them are part of the ledger we carry. So what is my final message? The thing I leave with you from this valley that smells of iron and old rain. It is simple and stubborn. Keep speaking and keep doing the small, useful things. Learn to sew a respirator. Learn how to filter water. Teach a neighbor how to test a battery. Keep a list of names and coordinates, and when you can, read those names aloud. Names are how we refuse to be reduced to statistics. Names are how we hold one another accountable, and how we keep memory charged like a battery waiting to be used. If you are listening from somewhere far or near, where machines still hum and the sky is still a proper color, do not assume you are safe forever. Prepare. Learn. Teach. If you are listening from inside this ash scratch of a world, remember that your neighbor is your first and best ally. Trust cautiously but give generously when you can. The work of survival is social as much as it is technical. Machines break. People do not always. I am tired. I have moments of fierce joy and long stretches of bone-deep weariness. I do not pretend to be transcendent. I am merely a man who pedals a generator, who reads names into a static sky, who tries to sew good out of the thin things left to him. If that is small, then let it be small. Small things, seeds, water, a stitched bandage, a borrowed battery, keep us long enough to find another small thing and then another. Tonight the pump sings softly. The children sleep. Barrow jokes at the council with a limp that will remind him of this canyon for years. Elena keeps a vigilant watch in the clinic and sharpens needles like a priest sharpening vows. Jessa writes the ledger by lamplight and the pages are full of bargains and promises. I will keep cataloging them. I will keep teaching, repairing, and speaking when I can. If you can do one thing after hearing this, pass along a skill. Teach someone how to make a filter, how to check a well, how to stitch a respirator. Pass along a seed packet. Names, skills, and seeds, they are a trifecta against erasure. We will not remake the world tonight and perhaps never, but we will keep it from becoming a story with only endings. This is not a hero's speech, it is a ledger entry. We are tired but still here. We are wary but still human. We are small and we are stubborn. Keep the line open. Keep the watch, keep the water clean. For now, that is enough to buy another tomorrow. This is Harrington. Keep breathing. Keep the lights low and the radio line open. Tell someone you remember them.